I'm here with physiotherapist and ADCC competitor Livia Giles and S&C coach Ben King, discussing strength and conditioning for Jiu Jitsu. In the last video we looked at S&C requirements of a competitive grappler and the challenges they face when introducing S&C into an already packed training regime. Now we're going to begin looking at Liv's S&C program she used to prepare for the 2019 ADCC European Trials. So now what we're going to look at is we're going to look carefully at an example of an actual strength and conditioning program in action. And we're going to start by looking at what Liv did in January, February, March in the run-up to the ADCC trials, which were, I believe, at the end of April. And so, Liv, what were your two main goals? I think you've told us it before, but what were the two main goals that you were looking to achieve before the ADCC trials?
Yeah, so I had two really big goals that were really important. One of them was to continue with my ACL, my torn ACL and my very injured knee rehab, and to make sure that I was strong enough to handle the stress of training and competing, and that I wouldn't cause myself more damage. And the other one was to bulk up to get as close as I could to 60 kilos. So I was probably sitting at around like 53, 54 kilos. And that was quite a bit under the 60 kilo mark for ADCC.
So Ben, when it comes to bulking up and putting on muscle mass, what are some of the important factors to take into consideration then when you're trying to develop muscle mass?
Yeah, so from a scientific point of view first, three ingredients you need: mechanical tension, so the amount of load that you lift, the eccentric damage, so if you think lengthening a muscle and creating damage as it lengthens, and metabolic stress, so the amount of burn you feel in a muscle, that'll create the environment, as well as a caloric surplus, so the amount of food that you eat, that'll create the environment for muscle to grow. But from a more practical point of view is if you look to do 4 to 5 sets of 8 to 12 reps on a particular muscle group over a course of a session, over a course of a week, you're probably looking at around, it's hard to say exactly because everyone's a little bit different, but you're probably looking around 12 to 20 sets for a given muscle group. So, you could split it up over 2 sessions being, maybe 5 sets or 6 sets of 8 to 12, or you can split up over 3 to 4 sessions, maybe 3 to 4 sets per session on a given muscle group. So as long as you're creating that environment within the muscle itself and you're giving it enough food or enough fuel to grow, the muscle will grow in a given sense. The difficulty with, Liv, an example like her, is the amount of training she was doing. It was really difficult to create that environment because we were always dipping into an overtraining environment, or, we're always dipping into an endurance environment, giving her her mat rolling and specific drilling and open mats, etc. So creating that environment is, for most people, is easy, but for high level competitors can actually be difficult to create that environment for muscle to grow.
And so now let's move on and talk about ACL injury rehab. So Liv, could you just talk a little bit about ACL injury rehab and what are some of the important principles that underpin that?
It does depend on the severity and the management of the ACL injury. So for me, I didn't have surgery. We chose to do conservative management with a consultation with my sports physician. So obviously how you approach these, like surgical versus conservative, are a little bit different. But in the end, the rehab, number one, aim is to control the swelling and pain. So in those initial few stages, as soon as the swelling is somewhat controlled, you want to concentrate on your range of motion. So the quicker you can get back your full extension and full flexion, the better. And this is, of course, depending, like if you have a torn meniscus as well, that might take a little bit longer, and you don't want to be pushing into end range if you have like a big chunk of meniscus stuck there, and you might be causing yourself more damage. But you certainly, if it's safe to do, you want to improve the range of motion. You want to be working on your proprioception. So once you have an injury to pretty much any joint, it doesn't have to be a knee, what happens is the little fibers that perceive where your joint is in space. So the brain will sort of communicate with the knee and get little inputs to kind of go, okay, your knee's right here, it's on top of the foot, and your brain knows exactly where that knee is. So when you land, you activate the correct muscles and you're safe. You can actually land correctly or change directions or whatever it may be. So after an injury to a joint, that gets a little bit disturbed and your brain doesn't quite comprehend where that joint is in space. And therefore it feels feels unstable. So, well, it might feel unstable because it is actually unstable. So the joint is floppy, but also anyone who's experienced like a sprained ankle even will tell you, you know, they're much more likely to like trip over walking on a curb or something like that. And that's because the brain doesn't quite recognize where that leg is. So it doesn't necessarily come back by itself after an injury, and it's definitely something you have to work on as soon as you can. So the more you work it, the more it gets better and better. And it might start off something as simple as standing on one leg with your eyes closed, and then progressing that to various levels of difficulties to, you know, changing directions and someone pushing you or wrestling or whatever it might be that's to do with your sport. And then, of course, we've got strength. So when you are doing conservative management, probably number one thing you want to work is your hamstring. So your hamstring attachments are in a similar place to where your ACL is. And when trained really well and you don't have an ACL, it can actually take, it can do the job of your ACL. So having a really strong hamstring that in all the ranges required for your particular sport. So obviously we're talking about jiu-jitsu, so especially that inner range is really important. So working that as soon as you can. And then we're looking at all the other things. So it's very important that you start working your calves, your balance, and then anything else. So like your core, your hips, and stability throughout your whole body. So that's pretty much what, you know, and that rehab doesn't happen over a 2-week period. It will be like 6 to 9 months to even a little bit longer type rehab.
What might be a relevant concept for people to hear, especially if anyone recreational listening to this, and I think it's become commonplace in, you know, high performance sport and athletics to realize this is a normal concept for us to think about, but you certainly shouldn't be guided by timeline only. Is your competency should guide your rehab, and if you're feeling good or feeling bad, and that's both within yourself and your own admission, but also from a physio point of view, an S&C point of view, is your structure and your function should dictate your rehab, not necessarily because a research paper says you should take 4 to 6 weeks to do X, or it should take 9 to 12 months to do Y. Those are pretty good general timelines, but if you're feeling better or worse than that, I certainly recommend for anyone listening that you should follow, you know, professional advice, of course. But if you're feeling better or worse than any of the symptoms that we've mentioned, or if you're feeling better or worse than any of the timelines that are mentioned, you know, follow those advice, because I've certainly had athletes that have progressed faster than the timelines that are mentioned, and I've also had athletes that have progressed slower than the timelines mentioned. So you need to follow what your knee is telling you and what the structure and the function of the knee is telling you, as is the same with any injury.
I would add to that, though, it does depend what the structure is. So, for example, if you've just had your ACL rehab and your surgeon's telling you not to do knee extension just because it can actually stretch the graft, when it's surgeon's protocols, follow that to a T. I wouldn't rush that. You know, obviously the surgeon might not know exactly what grappling is. So some things you'll have to work with the physio with your own body, but there's some specific things, like if they say don't run until week whatever, don't run till then. And it might be that, you know, your lighter athletes might be able to get back to running or impact sport a little bit, impact stuff a little bit quicker. Same, you know, when I injured my knee, I also fractured my tibia, like just where the ACL attaches is in the tibia, in the thigh muscle. It actually, like it's quite common that as it comes off, it can fracture the bone. So I wasn't allowed to do any jumping or running or any high impact activity for 12 weeks. And that's a directive from my sports physician. And that's something I stuck to because obviously that can cause you more damage. But for sure, like my return was quite quick because I trust my body quite a lot. And it was always in consultation with either a surgeon or a sports physician.
In fairness to that, you've got over 30 years of training experience and a very in tune knowledge of your body. So I would also advise anyone listening to also try and develop that in tune sense with your body, but trust your professional to give you good advice.
Yeah.
The reason I asked that question, you know, what are some of the principles underpinning ACL rehab, is because when we go and look at this training program, we'll see that there will be a lot of work for the hamstrings. There'll be a lot of proprioceptive work. But also, Ben, there's, you know, when you do your ACL or, you know, you need to recover from that, you need to train the athlete slightly differently than you might have done beforehand, right? There's around rate of force development stuff. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think in strength and conditioning, our world always thinks of progressions, and we always think, okay, how do I take an athlete from X to why, and we always think above the scale of where we're at right now, but we also need to think more so below of where we're at. So wherever we think a baseline is for any sport, is we need to consider both where we're going, but where we are. So it's assessing where the current state is, but also assessing the desired state. So from a I guess a physiological point of view, one of the things that any research paper will tell you in ACL, and this is where the complexity comes in, is that there's not any other complications. Like with Liv, she was a very complicated injury because there was many other co-founding variables beyond the ACL itself. So I'm not saying this is a broad statement for any ACL injury, but certainly one of the things we considered with Liv was that the rate of force development seems to be one of the things that in most knee injuries tends to be dampened. And theoretically, you can understand this because the body goes into protective mode and it tries to down-regulate any major forces that go through the joint itself. And it's particularly, as Liv mentioned, the proprioceptive feedback and the afferent neural feedback to the brain of what the position the knee is in and how safe it is and how well it's positioned to produce force or not produce force is disrupted. So the amount of force that the muscles surrounding the knee itself is down-regulated, and those muscles can't contract as quickly or as hard. So that's certainly one of my priorities as a strength and conditioning coach, is to get those muscles back producing force quickly and hard to protect the joint itself from compacting, from buckling, from getting in positions that are going to cause pain and swelling going forward. So I guess from a training principle point of view, I want to make sure that the RFD is back up to where at least at normal, if not better, before going back to training. But I'm very cognizant of the fact that, especially as we'll get into with Liv's case, that we were very time compromised and we were looking for as quick as gains as we possibly could get.
I think if I can add to that from an athlete perspective, so the first time I did my knee was in 2016, and I had the first time I tore my ACL and it was a pure break was in 2016. I had 3 weeks to get ready for Copa Podio, which was a big tournament in Brazil. And I actually competed successfully. I won that match. And as a physio, it got me thinking about, I was a little bit crazy and I experimented with myself to get back to the gym. I probably had about 3 days off of just gentle exercises at home. And then I was back at the gym to lift. And then I was back at drilling some stuff, literally 3 or 4 days later, which I probably wouldn't have at the time advised that to my patients. And I made a pretty good recovery. And then when I redid this knee, it was 10 days before EBI. And I actually thought up until about 3 days before EBI, I was still going to compete, which was just not possible. But then we did the same thing. I was back at the gym probably a day after I did this, a day or two, as soon as Lockie was like, okay, you can walk, you can now go to the gym. We were, I didn't really know, I didn't have my MRI results, but what I'm trying to say is I was actually back at the gym. I was back on the bike. I was doing mini squats. I was even deadlifting maybe 50 kilos or something like that with a pretty big injury. And it just made me think as a physio, wow, I've made pretty good recoveries in both these times. Why don't I get my patients that are, obviously not unstable and that have somewhat minimal swelling? I've been trying to get my patients to move a little bit earlier than having a full month off and atrophying and then creating this fear response in their head and all the other stuff. So I've definitely changed the way I practice or, with my patients based on my experiences as well.
Absolutely. I think that's really relevant for anyone listening, both from a strength and conditioning coach point of view, but also from an athlete point of view, is that sometimes the rest itself can actually be more harmful than the injury. Is if you rest and the down regulation of both your neural system, but the muscular protection around the joint, and also then from a psychological point of view, that you start to get scared. And, one of the things that I loved about working with you, but also the way that you trained was, it was always attacking your weaknesses, is that you put yourself in positions where you felt vulnerable all the time in both progressive ways, but also regressive ways when we needed to make sure that you're always addressing the fear element as well as the physiological capacity, which, I was trying to help develop. But there was also, you're putting yourselves in positions on the mat and in jiu-jitsu specific positions that it was I'm uncomfortable here. Okay, that's where I need to be. And, that's a mindset that a lot of people will avoid because it feels uncomfortable. It feels scary. It feels loose. It feels like it's going to break. And there was oftentimes you're on the mat chasing those positions. So I think that's a big dissonance between people that go through these injuries that come back from them really well, is that you are chasing the discomfort. And what people need to realize is that once you're a load compromised athlete, once you've had an injury, that's there theoretically for the rest of your life. So you need to be chasing those positions that are uncomfortable and are those that are going to cause you discomfort to make you get better at them. And I said it in the first podcast, but I'll say it again, is what gets you healthy will keep you healthy. And chasing those positions where you're uncomfortable within reason. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you should go straight from an LCL rehab straight to heel hooks or straight to like single leg landings of a box or anything crazy, but you should be finding what your stress tolerance is and just stepping outside of it, and then do that again and do that again. And you should just be stepping one foot beyond out of bounds and then coming back, and then another step out of bounds and coming back. So you're always increasing your stress tolerance beyond what the current capacity is.
So I think we got into quite a lot of depth there from a scientific perspective, but just to bring it back to what we're talking about now, when we talk about the fact that after you've compromised your knee, you need to become a power or a speed-based athlete, what that means is that we need to improve your rate of force development. In other words, essentially how quickly you can turn the muscles back on again. And this is why when you see Liv's program, you will see a lot of jumping and landing in that program. And you probably sit there thinking, as someone listening to this podcast, especially if you're not an S&C coach, you're sitting there thinking, well, hey, in Jiu Jitsu, we don't do much jumping and landing. Why would there be so much jumping and landing in Liv's program? And it's because it goes back to that principle we talked about earlier, which was the first thing you're trying to do is make the person a good athlete. Then you're trying to make the person a good grappler, and then you're trying to make them a good grappler for ADCC rules, as an example. And so this jumping is not necessarily required for Jiu-Jitsu, but it's required to make Liv, after her injury, back to being a good athlete first. So then we can go on and we can make her a good grappler, and then we can go on to make her a good ADCC grappler. So Liv, obviously you were doing this proprioception stuff in the gym. You were doing this hopping and landing, and we've got some videos that we can put up that show some of this stuff. But is it enough as a load compromised athlete to just do hopping and jumping in the gym, or do you also need to do some more sport specific stuff?
I definitely think you have to get a little bit more specific. So the hopping and jumping was a really good start. And, just getting used to the sensation of pushing off and jumping again and not buckling under my own weight, so to say, or with any changes of direction. But I felt really good and really controlled doing those after about a month or so. And it's probably because I got better control, but also it's a learned skill. So, I got better at actual jumping and pushing off and landing in the same spot. Problem with Jiu-Jitsu is that it's not always internally driven. So it's not always that I want to go, right, I'm going to step my leg here and that's going to end up there. You are getting pushed around by your opponent. And sometimes, in a training room, you get bumping into another pair from the back. You don't know where the attack is going to come from. And you have to train for that very specifically. So, for example, for me, I found that whenever I was shooting for a single leg, I was still staying on my knee, and I didn't have the drive forward, even though I was strong and I was stable. It wasn't specific. I didn't specifically train pushing off that particular angle that made me feel a bit queasy when I thought about my ACL, because it just wasn't really strong in that particular angle where the injury is likely to happen again. Things like standing up in close guard with someone a little bit heavier, or if someone was, on my back, or they were like shaking me around, I would just freak out and drop to my knees instead of actually trying to stay stable. So it was actually like Lockie who observed it a little bit, and we made a set of sort of very specific drills. So actually like quickly pushing off when I had a single leg with my training partner, or, someone resisting me from that, someone hopping me when I'm in a single leg myself, so that they're pushing me around and I have to react to them, not be dictated where my head wants to go. And other things, like I would get one of the lighter girls to jump on my back and shake me around as much possible as I would stand on one leg. And that was kind of like a little bit more jiu-jitsu specific than just, standing on one leg and bouncing a ball against the wall, because we don't need that in our sport. So we made up a lot of stuff that made me more confident on the mat. And then after that, it was things in rolling that made me really uncomfortable. So at the start of this whole journey, I was kind of like, okay, to my training partners, I would say, if don't put me in De La Riva or reverse De La Riva because I don't like it. Don't put my heels to my butt when you're passing guard because my meniscus is torn, so it doesn't have the range. When we get to close guard, just stop. We'll reset from a different position. But of course, before a competition, I had to be comfortable in those positions. So things that made me sort of cry and have a panic attack, I would ask my friend to come in an hour before class and just like literally attack a knee bar from a particular spot like 20 times in a row. And after about 10 times I would stop crying and go, okay, like I think I'm okay. It hasn't like combusted. I think I can do this. And it was just like exposure therapy really. And obviously knowing that I can handle it. Like I would never put myself in a spot where I wasn't ready to take the load and cause myself more damage.
So that's a psychological component to the rehab as well as the physical component. So obviously you've done the hopping in the gym in a controlled environment. You feel comfortable with that. Now you've gone and done some more specific jiu-jitsu situations, but in a controlled environment. And then you're getting someone that you really trust to come and help you to work in a rolling environment. And finally, I guess you're going with, like people that you aren't saying, hey, be careful about this, be careful about this. And you're actually taking it through those steps before you're back to actually feeling like I can go and compete. Because obviously when you're competing, the person's there to try and make you tap, aren't they? So they're not going to be nice to you.
Yeah, that's it. They're trying to break me. And also I can't not feel comfortable in a position. I can definitely be cautious in some positions. Like I have to be extremely careful when I wrestle, and I can't wrestle the way I would like to, because to me that's career ending if something else happens at this stage. So there's things I'm really choosy with, but at the same time there were some criteria that Lockie and I set before the trials that like, okay, if you can't do a roll in front of 20 of your training partners watching and cheering and not have a panic attack when you're in close guard or when someone's attacking a knee bar, or if you do that and your knee goes a week before the trial, like it was going to go anyway. Or if you can't perform this sort of key points, then you shouldn't be doing the trials, because you're not going to do it with more pressure, when the lights and camera are on you. So that was the motivator for me. Of course, I would have gone anyway, but even if Lockie didn't let me. But yeah, it is scary. It's really scary. And I think you have to acknowledge that, and you have to just face it. Yeah.
So to summarize some of the points that Liv was going through, I guess, generally speaking, in terms of a long course rehabilitation, the first point of call is to make sure the joints can actually do what they're not necessarily meant to do, but what they ideally could do is go through the full range of motion without pain. And there's certainly times where they won't necessarily go through that full deep knee flexion, especially with an ACL and meniscus tears. They won't be able to go through the full deep knee flexion without elements of discomfort, but you want a large amount of that range of motion back with good control and necessarily pain-free. To move on from that, you want to be able to develop good stability through a little bit more dynamic movement. So that might move from like single leg to single leg unsupported, single leg yielding environment. So things like jump and land, to single leg and then force expression. So single leg jumps, etc. And this is where you would hire a good S&C or a physio to guide you through this progression. And I'm just talking generally from a progression point of view, from injury point to back to general knee function. From there, you want to be able to develop a high amount of strength, and that will both come in the form of, as we spoke before, is hypertrophy of the muscle itself around the joints, but also just generally speaking is strength is good, and it's a protective mechanism. And if we go to a very basic analogy, is that paper is easier to break than wood. Wood is stronger than paper. If you try to break either one, paper you can rip. Wood is quite harder. So thicker and stronger muscle will be more difficult to disperse and put a joint in a more compromised position to stress the ligaments, tendons, surrounding capsule elements relative to a joint and a muscle that's stronger with more readily available muscle to protect that joint. And I think what's really relevant in the case of jiu-jitsu is creating tension where you need it. So a strong hips and strong core will protect the lower back. A strong hips and a strong quadricep and hamstring muscles that surround the knee will protect the joint itself. A strong calf and a strong soleus, as Liv mentioned before, will protect anterior translation of the knee itself. So having muscles that surround those joints will be really beneficial from a rehabilitation point of view, but from a longevity point of view, will actually be able to keep you more time on the mat and hopefully stave away some of those injuries that come as part and parcel of jiu-jitsu. From an overall programming point of view, Tom, what do you see as being the general coaching concepts that you would get across to any coaches or athletes on the mats?
Yeah, I think it's good that you asked that, because up until now, when we talked about injury prevention, we've talked about what to do from a physio perspective, what to do from an S&C perspective, all this strengthening, all this prehab, this kind of stuff. But I can't point out enough that whenever the discussion around injury prevention comes up, the most important thing that you should be talking about is also how are you programming your training, because ultimately it's your training that causes you to get injured. You know, if you sat on your arse all day and played video games, you wouldn't get injured, right? It's when you go to jiu-jitsu is when you potentially could get injured. What I mean by this is that you need to think about what are the high-risk sessions in your week. So, for example, the things that would generally be high risk would be things like wrestling, things with falling body weight. Possibly for Liv would be things like when she's going to do heel hooks, or she's going to stand up in closed guard like she talked about before. So you need to look at those high-risk sessions, and you need to make sure that, you know, you can't stop an injury from happening if it's going to happen when you do some of that stuff. But certainly if you are fresh and you are recovered for that session, there's a less chance of that injury happening than if you were exhausted. So it's really important from a programming perspective to make sure that when you know that you've got a high risk session, that you make sure you're recovered. And that's how you plan your week. It's how you plan what you do on the mat. And you should be talking to your coach about that and saying, hey, tomorrow we're going to do competition rounds. Today I'm not going to do rolling because I want to be fresh for tomorrow. And the reason I want to be fresh is because that way the chance of injury, if it's going to happen, will be reduced. The second thing is, of course, is as you get closer to competition, you do need to be more careful. And me and Lockie talked about that. We talked about the idea of a taper and the fact that 10 days, 2 weeks before the competition, you've really got to be careful. But it's also important to remember that the second thing that can really cause you to get injured is not being recovered, right? And not being recovered comes from a number of factors, one of which that you can control and one of which is very relevant to jiu-jitsu is if you're not eating enough food. So when you're cutting weight, you're probably cutting calories, which probably means you're going to be tired. So you need to make sure that if you are in a state where you're not eating enough food because you have to cut weight, that you're also extremely careful during those times as well. So don't just think about how do I get stronger, how do I do special proprioception activity or prehab or whatever else. Also think about how you plan your week, how when you do your training sessions, what is important and when do you eat enough food. Even if, let's say, you were cutting weight, right? The day before, or maybe a little bit before you come to do your specific sparring sessions or the ones that are really important, maybe you want to eat a little bit more food that day, and after you finish that hard workout, then you want to eat a little bit less, to make sure that you're ready for that session. And I can't, as a coach, I can't emphasize enough that ultimately you can do all the prehab, everything else in the world. If your programming's wrong, it's going to increase your chance of injury. So that's just the final little piece of the puzzle I want to make sure everyone's clear about. So having finished talking about injury prevention and your goals, Liv, let's talk about what you actually did. Okay, so I believe that you started off and you had your injury in December, and then the ADCC trials were in Poland in April, towards the end of April. And in a minute, we're going to go through and we're going to show your strength and conditioning program in January, February, and March, immediately before the trials. Can you just talk us through a little bit about the game plan between December and April and like what the phases were that you went through and maybe how your training would have changed across that time?
I got injured trying to prep for EBI during a wrestling round, and it was a pretty devastating, pretty big injury, and I wasn't sure if it was career-ending, actually. So I tore my ACL, I tore a bit of my meniscus, I tore my MCL, a bit of my LCL, I tore my calf, I fractured my tibia. I went to see my sports physician after we got back from EBI. Obviously, I just watched and supported my teammate, and he recommended to have a go at doing conservative management, so no surgery. Just from my previous rehab program, I did a pretty good job. And we also knew that if I went down the surgical path, it is really return to sport after surgery of an ACL repairs 9 to 12 months, and I was 34 at that time, so that's it's cutting it pretty fine, and might have been career-ending just because of the age and trying to get back into competing in my late 30s. So we decided to do conservative management. The rules are that if everything went to plan, I was allowed to return to competition probably mid-April, and I was banned from any jumping for about 12 weeks to let the fracture in my bone heal a little bit. We had to make some big choices. Usually I like to compete at World Pro, which is, I think, mid-April as well, around Easter time. And I really wanted to do both World Pro and ADCC trials. They were on the same weekend. So I had to make a decision to either cut to 49 kilos or to bulk up to 60 and put all my eggs in one basket for once, which actually really paid off. So I decided to do ADCC trials. It was a really big goal of mine. So we had it was after my wedding in January, so from maybe second week of January till end of April to get ready, so to have my knee functional and ready to go. So the aims were pretty much to obviously get strong in the gym, get some skills back in jiu-jitsu, practice whatever I could on the mats, and gradually add whatever skills I could do and whatever higher level of load on that knee. So I took December as I didn't have a very structured program, just because there was not a lot I could do, and I needed to just keep fit, and it makes me really happy to just work out, and I actually really love training. The other thing, it was right next to Christmas, so I didn't have a lot of work to do. I could actually spend quite a bit of time at the gym. So I would go to the gym pretty much every day and do about an hour of cardio, and I hate cardio with a passion, so I just alternated whatever equipment I could get on for about an hour. Bike is especially good for your ACL injuries, just because it's non-impact and it does force your knee into some sort of flexion, works your quads as well. So I spent a lot of time on the bike. And apart from that, I did all the stuff we talked about earlier. So I worked really hard on my hamstrings. I worked really hard on my balance and proprioception, my quads and glutes, abductors, adductors. So the whole lower chain, as well as core and whatever upper body I could do as well. I could smash out the upper body with higher weights. I was able to pretty much lift every day, just because the volume, I really couldn't overload the leg just yet. I couldn't put any or a lot of weight through it. So I wasn't able to really do any heavy lifts apart from smashing my upper body. So I was at the gym literally 2 hours a day. I had time, I had enough, I was eating, I wasn't cutting weight anymore like before EBI. So I could recover quite well. And then I would go to the gym and just kind of bother whoever was sitting out at any round, and just literally grab them and go, right, we're starting from the back, because that's the only thing I could initially work. I would start on the back with a seat belt, and they weren't allowed to touch my legs. I would just say, pretend my legs don't exist. We're just going to submission. And I would do that, as well as 50-50 on my bad side, which became my good side. And I actually got really good at doing heel hooks on my opposite side. So I did that for probably all of December. And then in January, I started working with Ben again, being ready to do a little bit more heavy weights and a structured program.
So as you moved into January, that's when you started to do strength and conditioning. And that's, I guess, when you got in contact with Ben. And Ben, can you just tell us a little bit about what happened in January and how you started to put together this program?
Sure. So Liv and I were in close contact throughout, she told me, I think the day of, or maybe the next day after the injury happened. So we were in close contact and kind of going back and forth on how she was progressing. But certainly in the early stages of her rehab, she led the program and in consultation with the sports doctor and giving early advice of what she should do. And I think that's pretty good advice for any strength and conditioning coach or any rehabilitation. That early days in the program, early days in the program should be led by the experts in that area. And acute phases, S&C can certainly have an eye over. But I'm not going to have, a lot of influence in. So the unique stage with us with Liv was that the fact that she is the physio and the athlete all in one. So it was a unique circumstance, but I certainly think that, I've learned a lot from that situation, but I think it was a really good environment to be in. Both that Liv could analyze and see what was coming from a physical point of view in terms of the sport, but could also understand where it was coming from a physio point of view. So in terms of the specific program, I tend to really like putting in the more rehabby stuff in the warm-up. I figure we have to do that stuff anyway, and it needs to be in the program somewhere, so we may as well do it before we train. So all the stuff that Liv and I had identified as things that kind of need to be in the program and things that are going to generally warm her up for the session to come should be in the program somewhere. So why not put them at the start of the session? So in terms of the warm-up, it was generally a combination of, okay, we need this in the program at some stage. So things like groin bridges and kettlebell sumo deadlifts were to work her adductors and some of the surrounding muscles of the knee joint itself, and also then to prepare her for the session. I tended to also prefer to put proprioception at the start of the session as well. So things like single leg RDLs, single leg balances, and mostly because she was fresh at the start of the session, generally speaking. I mean, that didn't always happen given the training environment. Sometimes she rolled before she did this program, but generally speaking, she was fresh. So to take advantage of a fresh, neuromuscular system is to put the proprioception and the more demanding stuff at the start of the session. And I was more tending towards doing loading towards burning point, or loading towards where we would actually feel a difference, rather than a typical prescription of like, 3x10 or 3x12. Is I'd rather get to the point where the muscles and the surrounding structures of the knee itself actually felt the work being done, rather than just prescribing an arbitrary figure that I'd learned in past. So yeah, that from a warm-up perspective, I just wanted to make that point because I think it's something that a lot of coaches might miss, is that there's a huge opportunity there to get a lot of that stuff that you're going to do anyway, but just get out of the way at the start of the program. And you're going to have to warm up. Regardless of the program you're going to do, you're going to have to warm up at some stage. So put all your rehab stuff in there, generally warm up, and then get stuck into the program.
So let's just talk a little bit about some of the principles behind warm-up. So in a general warm-up, there's a concept called RAMP, which stands for raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate. Could you just talk through a little bit about that and how those four factors were involved in your warm-up?
Sure. So raise, generally speaking, is raised body temperature. And I think that's both general core temperature. So, that's why you'll typically see programs starting with like 5 to 10 minutes of cardio in a general sense, either bike or run or row or, whatever it is. That's just to raise your temperature, generally speaking, of, your core musculature. But also I like to think specifically of the tissues that are going to get worked in that session, is you want to raise the temperature of those tissues to both increase blood flow, but increase the excitability of those tissues. So they're more readily activated as part of the session itself. That leads me into the second acronym is A, activate. So you want to activate, generally speaking, the musculature that's both going to support but be used in the session itself. So say if it's a more plyo-based session and the hip, knee, and ankle muscles are going to be used, you may want to activate more of the hip and core musculature because that supports the lower body in its movement itself. M, being mobilize. So mobilize the joints that are going to get used. So say, again, if I use the hip, knee, and ankle, so you might want to do generally some squats because that's going to include hip, knee, and ankle flexion, and that's going to get those joints generally prepared. And it works well, again, with the raise principle, is it's going to get those joints mobile, fluid, and just generally heated for more movement and more blood flow to actually increase the mobility of those joints themselves. And then P, which I think is a particularly relevant point and one that I tried to, as you'll see in the programs, use a lot of, is potentiate. And potentiation is a novel concept. And realistically, you can think of it as a really good warm-up, is you're trying to increase the excitability or the central neuromuscular innervation within a specific context. Is that if you do a really heavy squat before you jump, we've seen a lot of evidence and a lot of research to show that you'll jump a little bit higher. So what I want to do a really good job of is make sure the warm-up is to a sufficient level. So everything after that is going to be, sufficiently warmed up of. If you're not doing a good enough job of your warm-up, then the first deadlift you do, or the first squat, or the first pull-up, or whatever you do first as part of your program is still going to be part of the warm-up. And I can explain this no better than an example that I did at university, is that we did 6 sets of a 30-meter sprint, and we all were allowed to do a self-selected warm-up. And so we all went about our own different warm-ups, and inevitably we all saved ourselves, and we all kind of held back on our warm-ups because we thought, we've got a really hard effort coming. I'm going to do an easy warm-up. And so we all kind of jogged through and stretched our legs, and we were like, I'll just save myself. So the first rep we all did, we sprinted, and for every single person, the second rep was the fastest. So it shows the effect of potentiation on actual performance is that the first rep was actually still part of our warm-up. So if you only have one chance at an event, say jiu-jitsu or say, you know, any given sport, you'd want to make sure your warm-up's to a sufficient level that it's actually potentiating your event rather than saving yourself, which I think a lot of people will default towards because given, you know, they want to save their energy or save their effort or save their psychological prep for the event itself, but they're probably better served from a physiological point of view is actually exposing themselves to a maximal effort before they train or before they compete to get the most out of their physiology. And no better example than the sprinting example that I just presented.
So if we look here specifically at the warm-up in January, the first exercise was a groin bridge, which I guess is just like a bridge like you do in jiu-jitsu. The second one was a kettlebell sumo deadlift. The third was a gorilla row, and the fourth were basically push-ups. So it's all essentially bodyweight activities. But could you explain exactly why you chose those exercises as the first part of the warm-up?
Sure. So the adductors was something with Liv that she has huge mobility in, and generally speaking, her adductors can lengthen quite a lot. So one of the safest exercises that we had initially was groin-based and adductor-based exercises. Is that there was low risk, and there weren't things that if we went towards would cause knee swelling or pain. So I think that's a good principle for, you know, any strength and conditioning coach listening or any coach listening. Is that you know, sometimes it's just as simple as following things that don't cause pain and utilizing them to your best ability.
It's also very, very good for heel hooks. You gotta have a good squeeze.
And there's some specificity in there. I'll claim it. So from that point of view, it was something that didn't cause pain. It was relatively sport specific, and it was something that we could generally warm up the joints that we were using. From a gorilla row for me, you know, some people might call it something different, but it's just a bent over kettlebell row. And a push-up is just generally to activate and generally warm up the rest of the body. And, you know, a lot of people won't consider that the knee is involved in both gorilla rows and in push-ups, but there was a degree of extension and flexion in the knee that needs to be supported. And you'd be surprised by the amount of people that come out of ACL surgery and can't do a general push-up or a gorilla row because of the amount of load, and albeit relatively low speaking, but there's an element of load that goes through them. So general, and you know, as you've spoken about before, Tom, general athletic movement will serve well in this context because we were so soon post-injury and not necessarily out of surgery, but so soon out of injury itself that it would, you know, cause some discomfort. So it was worthwhile addressing in the warm-up. From a proprioceptive point of view, exposing Liv to some single leg stuff early in her program was relevant. You know, as you can see in the rest of the program, there's a lot of double leg, heavy strength focus. So having single leg work in the beginning of the program when she was fresh and when she was ready for it was relevant. And that was the most challenging part of her program, as Liv mentioned earlier, is the proprioceptive and afferent feedback from the knee itself is really downregulated post-injury. And that showed both in, you know, a position point of view, but from an RFD point of view. So having a level of control around the knee and exposing it to that in pretty simple context. So a single leg RDL and a single leg quarter squat balance allows the knee itself to feel positions where it's under load and under flexion, but in relatively controlled positions. So we're not actually exposing it to the point where it's unstable or against dynamic force or against unpredictable forces. So that was the justification for the warm-up.
Great. And I see there, like for most of the exercises, you put like a rep range in, so 10 reps, 8 reps, 6 reps, etc. But when it comes to the straight leg quarter balance and hold, you've written burn next to that. Can you just explain a little bit more about what that means?
So I wanted to make sure that the exercise was actually doing something to the surrounding musculature, and you know, the motor units themselves work on an all or nothing principle. So you know, there's two kind of ways that we can ensure that we're innovating the motor units around a joint itself, is that we can lift really, really heavy and high loads and work as explosively as we can, or push a muscle to the nth degree, and we get the motor units that way. So for this context, Liv wasn't ready for really explosive and really high dynamic efforts, given that she was so close to injury. So I wanted to make sure that we were at least getting some sort of maximal stimulus out of the muscles surrounding the joint itself. So I just wanted to make sure that say like, a really important muscle in knee control is the vastus medialis, the kind of teardrop muscle that surrounds in the medial portion of the knee, that actually had a pathway from the brain that it was working, it was alive, it was burning, it was actually feeling some sort of stability. And that was in close consultation with Liv herself, and to say, hey, what do we need in this warm up? What do we need to make sure that, is getting the feedback from the knee? So in terms of writing burn there, I just wanted to make sure that we were getting enough stimulus. And I'm certainly conscious of the fact that as a strength and conditioning coach, we're taught certain rep ranges that work, some that don't, some that are better, some that are worse. Sometimes you need to throw the rep ranges out of the cot, and the muscle doesn't give a damn about what rep ranges you prescribe. Sometimes it just cares about what it feels. So prescribing towards what the muscle it feels and what the body feels is more important than just like your arbitrary number that you come up with because you've read it in a textbook or you've heard it from someone before. So that's the justification of why.
So essentially, she just stood there on one leg. She went to a quarter squat, and she held it until she felt burning in that inside of the knee, basically.
Yeah, and certainly the feeling would be inside of her knee, but also some of the hip muscles that control the pelvic stability would also burn. And we would just hold that, and I would time that on my phone and just show the progression over time. So the first week it might have been 10 seconds, and hopefully next week it's 20 and 30 and 40, and over time that'll get better. Which typically in those positions it will get better. But it was a safe, from a programming point of view, it was safe, and it was effective in terms of we did feel the burn relatively quickly, and the muscles were working that were surrounding the joint itself. So, yeah.
So before we begin to examine the main workouts Liv used in her program, let's summarize the key take-home messages from this episode. We started off by looking at the science behind muscle hypertrophy and explain the importance of total load, eccentric damage, metabolic stress, and a calorific surplus to building muscle mass. We then looked at the pathway back from an ACL tear and some of the key challenges that Liv faced. We then discussed that in Liv's case, she needs to train more like a power speed athlete than what you might expect based on an assessment of the requirements of grappling as a sport. And this aligns with the idea discussed in previous episodes that you need to become an athlete first before becoming a grappler, and finally training as a rules or weight class grappler. We then talked about the importance of warm-up and the ramp principle: raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate, and how it can be used to help guide you through an effective warm-up. Finally, we discussed the fact that warm-up is a great place to place rehab and proprioception work before starting the main program. So hopefully you enjoyed the discussion today, and we'll tune in next time when we look closely at the main parts of Liv's S&C program. As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you can get notifications whenever Liv and Lockie release new content. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.